country, for instance, in South America, in Africa, and in Asia, where there would be decrease in rainfall, in region in which rainfall are already limiting for crops. So what does that mean for yields? Here, it's only taking into account the changes in temperature, and the source is IPCC, and you can see that the time horizon, it's a bit longer. It's not the same than in the previous slide. And what you can see here, you have the changes in yield with the same RCP, representative CO2 concentration pathways, for 4 main crops. And you can see that it's quite similar to what we saw with temperature. In the northern country, you may have even increase in production for all those 4 crops. But in other places, like for instance, especially in South America, Africa, and Oceania, you could have very large decrease and even some dramatic increase, for instance, as you can see here for wheat, with losses up to 50%. So that's very high, you can imagine it, and it could be even in countries in which on average yields are low. So for instance, it's of course an issue for food security, but that's without any adaptation. So now let's focus on adaptation. What is adaptation for IPCC? Adaptation, I will read the definition. It's the process of adjustment to actual or expected climate and its effects. In human systems, adaptation seeks to moderate or avoid harm or exploit beneficial opportunities. And IPCC distinguishes 2 types of adaptation. Incremental, in which actions aim to maintain the essence and integrity of the systems, which is opposed to transformational, in which you will have deeper changes and change the fundamental attributes of a system in response to climate and its effect. And it's important to make this distinction, because it's not the same type of change that will occur, and it will not be the same implication for farmers and their cropping systems. In the IPCC glossary, there is other related notions to adaptation. I didn't list all of them here, but for instance, you have things about assessments. Okay, if you design an adaptation, how to know if it could help facing climate change or not? You need an assessment. And then adaptation, you need capacity for adaptation to set them in place. And you can have opportunities to adapt or constraints. So all of that, what I wanted to show you is that it's all about people acting under a specific context, having opportunities or facing constraints. So what are the general levels for adaptation? You have here a list. I will not read it. It's based also on IPCC, and it's a general list of the type of adaptations that adaptation levels that can be used, with the potential of adaptation. All these options are mostly at plus scale, but included in farming system. For instance, if you change crop variety, you have to have a market for it. If you use agroforestry, it's the same. They are mostly incremental, while some are transformational also. It's the one in violet, like agroforestry, perennial farming, or crop livestock systems, which will radically change, which may radically change the state of the cropping systems and of the farming system. That's general option that could work everywhere or not, we don't know. So what for local scale? And that's in the examples I will show you before, try to answer part of these questions. So what about adaptation? How do we do? For us, there is three main steps, but I will focus on the 2 first, which is designing adaptation, assessing those adaptations, and then we should go for implementation. I will not talk about implementation today because it's not our specialty in my unit. So for design, what do we design? We design adaptation options, which could be changes in land use, which could be technical management, but also processing within the food chain, because it could be linked. Changes in crop, in the type of crops could imply changing the processes also. And it depends on labor, on market and food chains, and on regulation and norms. That's also part of the local context. And the methods, there is several, and here I mentioned the literature. So adaptations, there is a lot that are proposed by scientists, Participation, you can work with people to think on adaptation, on what could be, would be the best adaptation for a specific context, and you can use models. Regarding assessment, what do we assess? We assess usually both the initial situations, so without any adaptation, and with adaptation. And we can make this assessment on a very large type of indicators, on production, environment, labor, etc. And for this, the methods could be quantitative, qualitative, using expertise, or experimental. In my presentation, I will not give you examples for all, and for design, I will focus on methods using literature and participatory approaches, and for the assessment on quantitative and qualitative assessment approaches. So let's go for the first type of example. On the quantitative approaches, meaning based on models, as I said before, and I will talk to you about rice in Europe. So this example is based on a paper we made with Italian colleagues. And in this paper, we asked ourselves two questions. The first is, what are the trends for rice production in European countries? It's not really European countries, actually. It's south of France and north of Italy, with and without adaptation. And the second was, what are the sources of uncertainty related to climate and yield predictions? To answer these questions, for design, we used only literature. We read a lot of papers to see what could be adaptations for those specific conditions. And for the assessment, we used two crop models. So as I said, there were two sites, two crop models. We used four general climate models, two representative CO2 pathway, 2.6 and 8.5, two time horizon, 2030, 2070, and we used three incremental adaptation. Changing the cultivar with a longer crop cycle, crop growth cycle, and or changing sowing dates, anticipating sowing dates, also to increase the period of growth. What are the results? I will show you two. Here you have box plots of the distribution of our simulation according to all the modalities I showed before per modality. So crop model, variety, GCM, etc. So it's the yield. And you have without adaptation, with sowing adaptation, with adapting variety, or with adapting both variety and sowing. In red, you have the baseline median, the first quartile upper and the third quartile lower. And what you can see, I will not go into details, that's not my point, is that if you do not adapt, or if you adapt only sowing, basically you are always lower. You simulate yields that are lower, meaning that adapting only the sowing dates doesn't have any effect, or a very small one. While if you adapt the variety, or combine sowing dates and improve variety, then you have much higher yields than in the reference one. So there is a potential to increase yields in the future with climate change, with changing with highest temperature, if you use the right varieties, which are here with longer crop cycles. Then there were a second question, which was on the uncertainty. And we did an analysis of variance. And what you can see is the results where you have the mean effect on yield of changing some modalities. We had modalities of sites, on changing variety, on GCM. And what you can see here is that variety is not on the top, meaning changing varieties has a lower mean effect on yield than changing GCM. So what it means is that there is quite a high uncertainty based on the choices we made on GCM in this study, as a simulated effect of adaptation, of variety adaptation, is lower than the effect of changing the GCM. So it's just to make you think carefully about models. We need to know in detail what is below the simulation. Here, saying the effect of changing variety is of 0.4 tons per hectare. Okay, but how depend? What is the experimental design, the modeling design under? Then going for the second set of approaches I want to show you and examples, I will go for qualitative approaches, so based on participation, and I will talk to you about farming systems in Morocco. So here it's a paper we did with French and Moroccan colleagues, And the two questions we had, the first was, what are the possible future of main farm types under climate-related drivers of change? And then, for what resilience? The methods, as I just said before, they were for design and assessment, it was qualitative methods. We use qualitative methods for design to select what would be the main driver of change for each farm type, to characterize the current and future farm types using physico-cognitive maps I will show you just after. And for the assessment, it was done for each of the 4 farm types, and the idea was to semi-quantify key performances I will detail just after. So with who did we work in this participatory approach and how? We first did a preliminary step surveying farmers and local institutions. And then we did 2 workshops with 13 and 16 stakeholders, mainly public institutions. In the first, we also had the chance to have representatives of cooperatives and of crop buyers and crop sellers, but they unfortunately didn't come at the second step. So the first step of the study was to characterize the current situation. So we had 4 farm types at the end, and how did we set them up? 3 of them came from the literature. A few years, but really quick, not so long before we did this study, there were a very large survey of households. So we used their results because we wanted to use literature and not to redo everything. It's useless. So we identified 3 farm types adapted from literature. The first one is intensive vegetable with a very large use of inputs, including irrigation. The second type is semi-intensive cereal monocrop with no irrigation and medium use of inputs. And the third one is extensive with some irrigations. But then when we did the interviews, we identified that it was not covering all the diversity we were seeing in the field. So we decided to add a last one based on interviews, which was an intensive large farm, mixed arboriculture using also very largely irrigation, so quite intensive. These types, we did it before the first workshop, but it was of course discussed in this workshop and validated by the participants. Then what we wanted to set up was the type of drivers, what would impact future. So we used the time horizons of 15 years, which is quite, long enough to set up changes, but also to consider that not everything will have changed by then. And we asked the stakeholders to rank individually for each farm type what would be the driver. And then we used these votes to propose one main driver of change. What was it? It was climate change for two farm types and access to irrigation water for the 2 others, the two using the most intensively water irrigations. What is climate change for those stakeholders? It's a decrease in irregularity of rainfall, both within the year and between years. It's long droughts, it's extreme temperature, it's also shorter crop cycle, like for the rice before, and all of that, the main impacts would be lowering yields. Now I will focus on the farm type 3 because of time. I will not show you all the results of the paper. You will have all the references later. The next step was to characterize the current and future farm types using cognitive maps. What is cognitive maps? Here I show you 2 examples. It's a graph, a representation in which you have in box the concept and the row which a relationship which can be positive and negative between these boxes. We consider that one cognitive map is not dynamic, it represents an equilibrium. So you have here on the left for farm type 3 the current one, and on the right for the future. So that was done by groups of stakeholders during the first workshop. And you have at the center the farm types as it is, and the objective is to explain, to think why they are the way they are, depending on in this case, production factors, professional agricultural organization, policies, commercialization. And if I give an example, why is there negative signs between commercialization and farm types? It's because these farm types usually have low access to market. It's difficult for them to sell. They are quite far. And why policies are acting positively in commercialization? Because they are trying to set up policies, for instance, to reduce the number of intermediaries, also to set up structure closer to the fields, etc. And then we asked stakeholders to project these changes, these farm types in the future. So you can see here the main driver, which is climate change. And what they did is that they thought how climate change would be buffered, could be buffered by, for instance, policies or professional agricultural organization, and how that would affect the specific farm type we are talking about. And for instance, what they thought is that professional agricultural organization could help farmers to change, could help them with technical management, for instance, irrigation, and so that they would somehow lower the effect of climate change on these farm types. Then what we wanted to do, and it's the last step for this example, was to quantify, to semi-quantify the performance indicator for current and future farm types using the cognitive maps I showed you before. So when I say semi-quantification, it means that it was ranking between 1, very low, and 5, very high or at the top. And we used 8 sets of indicators like land, labor, income, yields, family assets, market access, irrigations, and policies. So for instance, for yield, the lower or more irregular yield, and the highest yield, and similar for income. So for this farm type, the farm type 3, what the stakeholders thought, so that was the last step, it was that the main effect of climate change would be in a decline in production and thus in revenue. So that for these farm types, it could be, if nothing is done to lower the effect of climate change, this could be very insecure for these farm types. This involved that some changes, a decrease in irrigated area, a diversification of type of labor due to changes in crop. When you would have a decrease in legumes, a decrease in irrigated horticulture, and the introduction of rustic arboriculture needed some labor, explaining the road just before. To come back to what I said before, if we can think that the 3 first are mostly incremental because it's only changing slightly, the last one, it means training, it means knowing new know-hows because it's new crops, and also training and acquiring experience. Then regarding the assessment, so based on what stakeholders told us, so you can see in black the current performances, in red the future one, and you can see, I will not go into details, that basically there is not much changes. The future income and yield, income and labor would be lower. For policies, the impact will be higher, but it's very low changes. So it means that for those stakeholders, even though climate change would have very large impact, everything that will be done locally will buffer those impacts, and so these farms could challenge the effect of climate changes. That's according to the stakeholders, and that was true for all farm types. So diversification was the option chosen for all, and the small changes in performances between current and future meant that there were a relatively good resilience. That was according to the people we were talking with. It doesn't mean that if we would have talked with more farmers, we would have the same adaptation, and we would have the same projection in the future with the same resilience. So it really depends on who you are working with. The third example, so on Vineyards in France, that was done by colleagues of mine in the project LACAV, especially Jean-Marc Touzard. And the questions, what future for Vineyards in France and what action for adaptation? That was qualitative with 3 sets of participatory approaches aiming at a prospective study. So these different participatory approaches, they didn't target the same public. It was not the same people that were involved. In the first one, it was experts with the aim to build scenarios I will show you just before. Then there were open forums in 7 regions where there is vineyards to specify and choose scenarios and to propose actions for climate change adaptation. And the last one was for the French government, an expert collective analysis to prioritize the action proposals to propose a national strategy. So that was all qualitative. Also for assessment, also qualitative, the experts set up some criteria to choose these final options. Like it should not be specific to one region, it should be assumed as relevant and efficient, it should be feasible, and the associated risk should be low. That was qualitatively assessed. What was the 4 scenarios? So a scenario is a projection in the future under some drivers, and you can see here that it was drawn on two axes. The first one is the extent of moving, so relocation of vineyards, and the second one is the intensity of innovation, how much you adapt. And you have 4 scenarios according to the level of changes on these 2 axes. So for moving, you have a range from no relocation to something that is even more than relocation, which is artificialization of viticulture. So no more terroir, no more anything. And in between, you have a range of options, which could be relocate vines within a terroir, changing the border of a terroir, etc. And so the larger the relocation, the more nomad is the vineyard strategy of adaptations. And for intensity of innovations, you go from no innovations to very radical one. I use their vocabulary, which is radical here, but which could be transformational according to what I said just before. So it goes from no innovation to incremental, like changing varieties, changing density, radical, changing irrigation varieties. There is twice varieties, but it's not the same varieties we are talking about. For radical, it could be some that do not exist yet, or for instance, drought-tolerant variety, and to very radical one, like using GMOs, or changing processes in wine, like adding water or aromatizations. What I wanted to show here is that it's not all about cropping practices. It's about spatial. Here you have the spatial component, and here you have also processing. It's winemaking processing, and not only varieties, for instance. Then I skip the second step of the method I showed you before to go to the third step. And so the expert has selected 30 actions. I will not show you all of them, of course, but they classified it in 7 domains of priorities, which gives somehow a roadmap for the government to set up, to anticipate and to set up actions nationally for vineyard adaptations. So the first one was on improving the knowledge on wine growing areas, for instance, internal climate, but also who belong the lands. The second, to act on production conditions, mainly focusing on water, limiting water constraint, developing irrigation, including drip irrigation, promote adopting plant material, drought-tolerant varieties that I was saying before, acting on enological practices, developing markets, developing research, and the last one is more on mitigations. Here, this list is not, it's not the list that is important. It's to see the different pillars, that it's a set of actions that can help adaptation. People will not act alone in their field. They need the context to change, and they need also to be trained for that change. Going to the last set of examples. So I will talk to you of mixed approaches. What I call mixed approaches is combining both qualitative and quantitative approaches. And I will talk first on vineyard in southern France, so also vineyards, but in specific regions. So it's these slides are based on the presentation of a PhD student of mine, Audrey Nolot, and it's based on 2 of her papers. The questions: what are the effective adaptations for climate change of vineyards in nationally and internationally, and locally on the specific watershed she was working on, and to what effect can the combination of plot technical changes and their distribution within a watershed help to adapt. So what was the methods? For design, she used both literature and participatory workshops. She did 4 series of workshops to make a conceptualization of the systems, to see what is the system according to the stakeholders, what could change, what would be the adaptation, and to characterize the current system and their possible adaptations. And for the assessments, she used dynamic modeling, combining different types of models, and 1 series of workshops. It's important to see with who she worked. She worked with local stakeholders, who were mostly farmers, and she also worked with experts in 2 separate groups, mainly due to COVID situation at the time she was making the workshop. So that's one result of adaptations at literature. What Audrey did is that she wanted to highlight that there is the impact of time and space. So you can see here that she distinguished different scales, spatial scales, from the plant to the regions, and 2 types, like short-time adaptations and long-term adaptations. And in the middle, you have the outputs that were used in those studies, meaning that these studies, for instance, they studied the effect of changing soil management on water status. So water status, what the indicators that was assessed. So you can see that there is a large range of spatial scales, but also different adaptations in time. And what she wanted to see was how intensive were studied those adaptations, and also what was the type of outputs. Did they have a positive impact in green or a negative impact? And what you can see is, for instance, irrigation, which is a short-term adaptation, which is the most used, the most studied in the literature. It could be assessed on several components of the system, like berry composition, yield, and water status. And what is interesting is that the effects are not straightforward. For instance, for yield, in half of the case, irrigation increases yield. In half of the case, it's neutral. But for berry compositions, it could even have a negative effect. So it's not straightforward. It's not one adaptation at one will have the same effects everywhere in the world for vineyards. Then let's go for the participatory approaches. So she used these results in the participatory approaches, but the idea was more to work with people to see what they would thought about adaptation strategies. And here you have the 4 strategies we developed with the stakeholders. The first one was to delay the harvest, and below you have the levers using late varieties, promoting a cool microclimate. The second one was to limit water constraint using, of course, irrigation, but also cover crop management and drought-tolerant varieties. The third one, related to what I was saying before for the project LACAV, relocate the vineyard locally. And the last one was on the improvement of the soil ability to retain water. So you can see that in those levels, there is some that are transformational and that they are included in all the 4 strategies. I will now focus on only one, which is the limiting water constraint one because of time. Here you have the assessment, so you have the historical total mean productions and the projection of the current cropping practices in the future at 2 time horizons. So that's the baseline. That's if we don't change anything. Currently, there is 10% of the area that is irrigated. We don't change anything. But what if we adapt? If we set up adaptations to limit water constraint? And at the top, sorry, you have the irrigation water needs. So I mean, if we don't do anything, we lose productions and we double the irrigation needs, doing exactly the same except for irrigations. Then one scenario, one strategy that was proposed by the stakeholder based on their knowledge was to increase the areas irrigated at some place, because it's not possible everywhere and not with a very large quantity everywhere. So what is the effect? The effect is that you buffer the decrease in production from here to here and there, but you dramatically increase the irrigation needs. You can see it, it's quite obvious. So what if we add short-term adaptations like canopy decrease and within 1/4? You can see that you do not change the water needs, irrigation water needs, but you buffer quite a lot the decrease in total productions. And then if you had long-term adaptations like reducing density or shading, you can see that you even buffer more the decrease in total productions while lowering somehow the irrigation. But what that means is that the adaptations they need to, so it is a small watershed, and even in this small watershed, you can see that it's not the same levels that will be everywhere. I mean, when you work with stakeholders, they are very specific on what is possible where, depending on the on the type of, on the labeling, etc. And you can see that even though irrigation was not for us the first driver, it was here a very important one. Then Audrey, the PhD student, she wanted to evaluate with stakeholders those levels, and she asked them to see if for them they were desirable or not and feasible or not. You have here the levels I showed you just before, which are the ones that were modeled. And what you can see is that shading, which we showed just before as very effective, it is for them neither desirable, neither feasible. While there is some, like canopy reduction or density reduction, that are seen as both feasible and desirable, but they are not possible now with the current label specification. And here you have the ones we couldn't model, the ones that we don't have the process, we don't have the knowledge to include them in the model and to assess the effect of adaptations. And you can see here that you have some, like soil quality, adaptive management of cover crops, that are seen by stakeholders very feasible and very desirable. But the question remains, are they effective? And with the tools we have now, we cannot answer these questions. Then the last example on rice-based farming system, a paper we did with French colleagues in Camargue, so in one of the two regions I was presenting at the beginning of my presentation. And here the questions are quite the same we did for the Moroccan case study, like what evolution of agricultural systems for what performances. But we used different types of methods. For design, we use only participatory approaches with 3 workshops to choose the drivers, like before, to build the scenario, like before, and to design the adaptations. And then for the assessment, we used one bioeconomic model, which quantifies social, environmental, and economical performances, and one workshop to share it with the stakeholders. And here we work with a smaller group, only 4 stakeholders and 1 expert. So here is the drivers that were set up by the stakeholders. You can see there are different domains. For example, for agronomic, it could be about new technical options, water management. For environmental, like changing the environmental regulation, how that would impact the system, the cropping systems and farming systems. About economic, like the prices of commodity, of energy, or social, for instance, changes in diet. So based on this list, we asked the stakeholders to choose the two drivers that for them would be the more important for the future of farming system. And what they choose, you have here the first, was the economic conditions for rice cultivation from unfavorable to favorable. And the same for climate, which is of our interest today, from low climate change to high climate change. I will not show you all of them, of course. What I wanted to highlight is that the type of adaptations that were proposed by stakeholders were different according to these different scenarios, and in some they were more transformational, like mixed farming, and in others they were more incremental, like changing crops because of the impacts of climate change mainly. So I will now focus on the scenario D, and it will be the last slide for the examples before the conclusions. So the adaptations would be changing mainly land use, so crops, crop management, and then to assess the performances. And what you can see here, okay, you can't see here very well, is that here you have the conventional rice, and if you have very nice economic conditions for rice and you have a high climate change, it will favor for stakeholders growing rice. So you will have much more rice. And you will have no more wheat, for instance, which disappear here. And you will also have less organic. That's due to other drivers I did not mention here, because the scenario is not only 2 drivers, but it's a lot of drivers that are embedded in a narrative built by stakeholders. And what was the performances? Here it's only examples. You have in gray the reference, and in black the scenario D, on the top indicators on mainly productions and labor, and below on the environment. And what I wanted, the only things I wanted to say here is, like I said before, it's not straightforward. I mean, one set of adaptation according to changes in context in this scenario, it will not be better for all performances or lower for all performances. As you can see here, for instance, you would increase the total volume of productions, but you would decrease the gross margin, and you will increase environmental performances like more emissions of particulate matter and more greenhouse gas emissions. So to conclude, adaptation depends on context, depending on the drivers that will be mobilized and how they will be mobilized, the adaptation will not be the same. And for a given set of adaptations, they will not be all positive for the environment, social, production, etc. But there will be a gradient of performances, and it's not straightforward to assess them. Then to conclude, 3 slides only. The first one is on the challenges on design. So I showed you methods based on literature, based on participatory approaches, but not on models. And for the literature based, when we use literature, the point is that it's difficult to see how this adaptation could be set in place in, let's say, in the real world. I mean, it could work perfectly with models, it could be perfectly with experiments, but what in your specific case with your specific context? Moreover, they could be limited. Researchers, they do a lot of stuff, but they may not think of everything, especially in combinations of adaptations. So it could limit creativity, and maybe those adaptations, they will just not be feasible in the field, in the specific context you are working with. Participatory, let's say the main bias depends on participants, who you are working with and why they are here. Are they here to defend something, to block the situation? You have to take that into account. Is there issues of for instance, hierarchy between the participants? And for models, I didn't show it, but you could use models to explore a very large range of adaptations to select what are the best ones. The same for optimizations. Then to go further, the point for me would be, and what we try to do in my unit is to enlarge the view, not to focus on only one method, but using different ones. To be more creative, to find new, to think a bit differently on adaptation, I propose here 3 ways. The first, in finding innovation in the real world, going to see the farmers and tracking their innovation, see what they do, how they do, and if it could be feasible and efficient in another part of France or other world. Then favor creativity with, for instance, innovative design to go more towards transformational adaptations. And the last one, which may be a very important one, is think systemic, because one options at one scale, for instance at third scale, may depend on other on other levels, like I was saying, for instance, for changing varieties and adapting the processing of wine. The same on evaluations. I showed you examples based on pre-existing models and participation, but it could also be done on experiments. The point is that it's costly, it's time consuming, but the very nice point is that it may favor adoptions, because people will practice it, people will see if it works or not, based on pre-existing models. I really talk about pre-existing models, not developing the model for this specific study. It would be something else. It could be seen as relatively quick, cheap, if the model is available, but, and it allows to explore both in time and space, as I was showing in my Vineyard examples of the PhD thesis of Audrey Nolot, but it needs very specific skills, very large knowledge, a lot of data. It cannot consider all adaptations, as I tried to show before, and they may remain uncertain. So it's not to say do not use them, but be careful. And it's the same for participatory. It can be seen as cheap and quick, but it also needs specific quiz, and it can be biased for the same reasons I mentioned just before, of who is participating and why. So to go further, and it's what we try to do in my unit and in my team, is to combine, not to do only one, and also to repeat it in time, to do it in an iterative way, to combine methods, to combine points of view, and to combine disciplines, not to work only within a unique discipline. And this will be my last slide. It's just to remind you that climate change, it's one issue among others. I mean, farmers, what they are facing day to day, it's market fluctuations, weather variability, not change, but variability plus pressure, changes in policies, and so for them, even though they think on climate change, it may not be the first issue they want to think on. Moreover, it can require substantial investment, and it's conditioned by internal and external conditions, for instance, for irrigations. And finally, I just wanted to warn you about long-term horizons. I show you here very long-term studies, but as some stakeholders told us, everything will have changed by then. So it's nice to make scenarios, but you always need to see it as explorative tools, and just explorative tools, like tools to help thinking, but not always to drive actions. Thank you for your attention.